We continue to unpack this story as it unfolds, and joining us now is Angelo Fick, who's the Director of Research at the Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute in Johannesburg. Angelo, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Always good to talk to you. There was so much confidence going into this conference. They were optimistic that they were going to finish on time and there would be no problems. But I suppose the Ekurhuleni quarantine was just one of those things that they parked hoping that it would go away, and it's come back to bite them.
Good evening, Peter. Precisely, and even calling it the Ekurhuleni quarantine sounds rather more ominous in this era of pandemics. And so it's always been, I think, a challenge for the ANC in Gauteng, given that it has consistently projected an image of itself as being slightly less convoluted and slightly less troubled than other provincial parts of the ANC, that this is, not a good moment. We've had the leader of the provincial caucus having to go into various regional conferences and calm things down. The NEC has had to deploy a national dispute resolution group into this conference, and a court challenge in the Gauteng conference. And this is, I think, partly because this is the economic heartland, as Perry pointed out. This is the space in which they've lost control of 3 metros, the economic capital, the aerotropolis they were so proud of at the 2014 general elections, and the capital of the country. And that must lead, as David Makura and Gwede Mantashe have both pointed out, an eye on 2024 and the future of the party, not just at the provincial and municipal level, but at national level.
But in all fairness, I guess none of what we're seeing should surprise, because this has been the theme within the party for a long time now.
Absolutely, and it's not just a question of people contesting, as the spokesperson said, and some of what he said ought to alarm people inside the ANC. Political party conference should be sorted by the time you get to the provincial conference or the re-conference. There shouldn't be contestation around branches and accreditation. I mean, the phrase that he used was, you can start a branch with your eye to the conference. Surely there should be a regularized audit on an annual basis or even a 6-monthly basis to make sure that you don't have new branches popping up, weeks ahead of a conference or months ahead of a conference. And so the kind of chaos that he describes and saying that this is normal, this is just the way in which the ANC works, really doesn't bode well for a party that wants to not just retain its national power in 2024, but actually make gains at the local and at the national level in the elections after 2024. And here it's a question of discipline. We've known for at least a decade, as you pointed out, that discipline is a major problem in the party. For somebody to take the party to court at its provincial conference speaks to ill discipline.
What does victory mean for whoever wins these races? Last week we spoke to a political analyst, and he said, look, in all fairness, Lebohang Maile and Panyaza Lesufi are the pallbearers of the ANC in Gauteng. Is there something to win here?
Well, I think for the people contesting, there is the short-term vision of having to patch up the long-established and quite elaborate patronage networks, and those people have to be pacified and they have to stand in line. But there has to be a longer-term vision for whoever wins, which is to return to municipal governance in these very key municipalities, and at least retain the provincial government or any kind of short-term between now and 2024 patronage network that you set up is lost altogether come 2024 if you do not win the province. And so there's that issue. As for being pallbearers, I think, the pallbearers have gone. We're now at the point of whether we're decorating the grave and whether we're laying a gravestone, because in the longer range, the party has been in decline, and there that decline better. It is very difficult to see a party in the kind of internal conflict that it is in returning to the strength that it had at the turn of the millennium. And so the Gauteng base of the party certainly has to consider whether or not it wants to continue to project this fiction of itself as separate and different from the rest of the country's, the ANC in the rest of the country, particularly in provinces like KwaZulu-Natal, the Northwest Province, and Limpopo, or whether it has become like those provinces precisely because patronage networks, the very system that Gwede Mantashe and a year ago Cyril Ramaphosa defended, which is the cadre deployment network. Cadre deployment, as the state capture report pointed out, is not a way to undo corruption. Patronage politics is not a way to undo the kinds of damage we've seen from ANC governance and that people have been complaining about. And so, this is a real challenge for the people coming in, that they can't just do the kind of spectacle politics or spectacle service delivery issues, that they're actually going to have to change the substance of people's lives for the better rather than just at the symbolic level.
If I'm sitting as the communications director for the ANC, I would be wondering just how difficult this job is, because it just seems week after week there is a a challenge. Today we have this court case, and behind that, you have this conference that was held by the former president, still a member of the ANC, and all of the drama that goes with the things that were done during state capture, where the party itself was named. And then those that are there have to try and find a way to distance themselves, but they can't really, because they've got to own the things that was done in their name.
And not just in their name. I mean, the whole point of the 2018 Valentine's Day changeover following the election of Cyril Ramaphosa in 2017 was that it's supposed to be a new dawn. And what the pandemic revealed, that it's far from a new dawn. It was just later that same day. The night hadn't yet even settled into the horror of true midnight to 1 a.m. nightmare. What we've seen is the PPE scandal, the contract awarding scandal, various people violating the lockdown rules in public, even as they served as ministers. This is not a good moment for politics in South Africa, and it reflects, ironically, politics globally, where those who govern seem to establish rules that they don't want to abide by. And so, as you pointed out, with the state capture release, coming in the middle of this year, in this winter of discontent, of rising costs of living, rising fuel costs, rising food costs, and continued malaise of unemployment and unemployability for so many young people in a majority young country, it is a crisis the ANC is going to have to face between its elective conference at the end of 2022 and the general election that it faced 2024. And whatever Cyril Ramaphosa comes back with as president of the country in October in his response to the state capture report, that's going to have an impact as well, not just on the internal dynamics of the party leading up to December 2022, but on the electorate and the general public's vision and view of the party and the seriousness at which Cyril Ramaphosa is taken as somebody who says he wants to, attack corruption. But it's not just a nightmare for at the PR level for the communications directorate. It's also a nightmare, I think, for the secretariat of the ANC. If members of branches can take the party to court, it really speaks of discipline issues at the branch level and the control that the NEC wanted to hand back to the PEC to control what's going on in the regions is, I think, part of the problem, that there is bottom-up, top-down conflict that the Secretariat will have to sort out. And this has been a problem that they've tried to sort out at least for the last 6 to 8 years, which is those branch audits, the various audits of the delegates that make it to conference. And it doesn't seem to be improving much. And that I think, should alarm people who sit in control of the party and its structures.
We're talking quite a bit about the external, looking in. I just wonder what might be going on inside the party. Card-carrying members who continue to pay their subscriptions, what might they be feeling and thinking watching all of this unfold? We know that the voters have been walking away and sometimes just not showing up. But what about those that are still in the party? Because they have to mobilize, motivate, and inspire. What might they be thinking watching all of this play out?
One has no idea what such people could be thinking. Presumably, it isn't just blind loyalty to party. There must be people who have faith in what is projected as the ANC's role in South Africa, and not just historically, but on paper, what it sees as the way forward out of the malaise, not just for the party, but for the country. I think of those people as people who really have a kind of internal crisis. And it's a crisis that I think many people who identify as left around the world have in contemporary organized formal politics. We see this in other societies where those people who identify in the progressive terms often find themselves at odds with the historical homes in which they would have been slightly more at ease. We see this in the Labour Party in the United Kingdom. We see this in the left coalitions of Europe. We're seeing it in all sorts of progressive movements across the African continent, where once the progressive movement's party arm has taken power, a very different trajectory is suggested. Now, the ANC has always constructed itself as somewhat exceptional as a liberation movement, become a governing party. But I think part of the tragedy is just how many consistencies there have been with other liberation movements become governing parties in terms of the setting corruption, the patronage politics, the networks, and the failure to deliver the largesse that comes with post-independence, post-colonial freedom and local governance over the imperial rulers. And how much of that has been complicated by neoliberalism's rise, the rise of multinational capital, and the ways in which the misgoverning of the economy has been projected as somehow an outsider's fault, not an inside mismanagement. But I think that those people inside the party who still are loyal to the party and want to see the party survive into the next decade, the 2030s, have much hard work to do beyond the soul searching. And that, I think, is often difficult for people who think of everybody else that is a card-carrying member of the party and has been encouraged to do so as a comrade, even though there are these, what used to be called a broad church, these conflicting interests, conflicting desires, and conflicting compulsions between the short-termists and the long-termists.
The president has, for a good number of years now, been pushing the unity story. One word that we've learned in more recent years is the idea of slates. And I just wonder, have they always been there, or is it that we've just become more aware because the divides has been so much more pronounced?
I think, that other observers have, at least since 2012, spoken of how the factions or slates used to be ideological. It had to do, when the ANC was a liberation movement, about the process of by which means and under what ideological principles you're going to oppose apartheid. What we've seen in the post-millennial space of the ANC is that the slates or factions have become not ideological, but resource-driven. And the relationship between has not been, about which political direction the state should go in, so much as which political direction control over the resources that the state gives you access to if you're in power should go. Do you go with the direction of large-scale kind of capitalist looting, and whether that is rent-seeking in the legitimate way or corruption of the kind, or whether you follow the direction that had been supposedly the socialist arm of the ANC and its alliance partners in the South African Communist Party and the labor movement of COSATU, which often, you really can't see the influence of these people. Some of them have been in ministerial positions under a neoliberal economic policy. Austerity measures have kicked in. And yet we live in a country that has become even more unequal than it was a decade ago, where poverty is on the rise, unemployment is on the rise. And so you have to wonder whether, this continued insistence that this is slate politics around ideology is actually about slate politics on how to divide up the pie and to whose benefit, rather than whether or not the divisions that are, or the sort of division of spoils isn't among the party loyal, but among the country members, because that, I think, is the challenge the ANC faces, how to unearth or uproot this culture of benefiting those on the inside and actually benefiting the 60 million people who live here.
Might the people of South Africa demand a different way to get to the service deliveries and that kind of thing? Because at the moment, it looks as if a small minority of people actually end up deciding for everybody.
Yes, and we're beginning to see, well, we aren't beginning to see, we've seen for at least the last 20 to 30 years. We're on the 28th year of independence from the apartheid government, and we're seeing people every year doing those service delivery protests, those protests about the failure to govern, which I think is an indication that people are exhausted. The other issue is that several people in the middle classes have gone and privatized so many of the functions where the ANC has governed so poorly. And so we've seen a boom in private education from pre-primary all the way through to higher education. We've seen the privatizing of security for the middle classes. And we're beginning to see aspects of that in the working classes where, sort of poorer neighborhoods are beginning to privatize through neighborhood watches and community and block actions, the kinds of functions that the state really ought to do. And we've seen working class people move into private education with these, and with often quite dubious consequences, with these fly-by-night schools and colleges. And that ought to alarm the ANC because, their policies, the very freedom charter that they're celebrating tomorrow, had a very different vision of a post-apartheid South Africa. And after 28 years, that's a whole adult. I mean, that's somebody who's entering middle age. The failures are spectacular and quite worrisome. And I think for the people inside the party who still believe, rather than the people who are inside the party, as what Samir Amin used to call surfer politicians, people only there to enrich themselves. Those people have hard graft ahead of them. And it's going to be very difficult. We've seen political assassinations, we've seen whistleblowers taken out. And so Cyril Ramaphosa and those who support the project that he announces repeatedly when he speaks in public have hard work ahead of them to fix the party and the country simultaneously, particularly a party riven, as you've indicated, by various factions who are pulling in very different directions and yet want the ordinary voting public to believe that in 2024 they can simply pull back together and have a unified direction going ahead.
Angelo, always great talking to you. Thank you so much indeed for joining us. Your insights greatly appreciated. Thank you.